When my boss called me in and told me that I was going to be put in charge of Tuskegee, and I said, I don't want any part of a mess that the United States government has already made.
Welcome to Archival. I'm your host, Juanita Tolliver, and today we're digging into family archives. My family archives. When I committed to starting this new show, my first guest was an obvious choice. It had to be my granddad, Arzell Lester. I've been interviewing him since high school during family visits when only he and I were awake at the crack of dawn, talking about school, life, and history. And one day we started talking about his history. When Arzell Lester entered the CDC in 1961 as a fresh Morehouse College graduate, he had no way of knowing that his 25-year career would culminate in being appointed director of the Health Benefits Program and approving the medical claims of the men subjected to the U.S. Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis at Tuskegee. And just like the rest of the world, he didn't even know that the study had already been happening for nearly 30 years before he even set foot inside of the CDC, then the U.S. Public Health Service. I uncovered my granddad's archival records by accident after Thanksgiving dinner in 2018 at his home in Atlanta. We were all lingering around the dining room table, reminiscing over family photos, when I picked up the stack of photo albums in the living room. But one of the albums was larger than the rest, and it didn't even hold photos of my family. It was an album of copies of photos. They were delicate, black and white prints with crinkled edges, and they included groups of black men standing proudly, heads held high, in front of a store and another group in front of a church. There were people having their blood drawn on the side of the road and in cotton fields. I did my best to stay calm and not disrupt everyone around the table, and I even cupped my hand over my mouth. After a few moments, I turned to my granddad and asked him, "What is this?" holding up the thick book. Without hesitation, he told me to put it back where I found it. But as someone who doesn't follow orders, even from my granddad, I kept looking through the album. I tried to sneak and take pictures of the pictures with my phone when I thought he wasn't watching me. But of course, he was watching me. After a few moments, he sat back in his chair and said, "The CDC put me in charge of approving the medical claims submitted by the men subjected to the Tuskegee study." Everybody in the room gasped. I knew of the infamous unethical study and how public health officials denied care for men and subjected them to unnecessary, painful medical procedures, including spinal taps, for 4 decades. I knew that they did all of this without the men's informed consent to even participate in the study, but I'd never seen the faces of the people impacted. And I never knew about my granddad's proximity to one of the biggest stains on the legacy of the U.S. government, the U.S. public health system, and the horrific wake it created. Mr. Arzell Lester didn't tell me fully about his experiences approving medical claims for the people impacted by the study until spring 2025. That April, he FaceTimed me and said, "I want you to sit down and interview me about my work at the CDC." Once I got over my shock about his ability to even use FaceTime at the ripe age of 91 years old, I booked a flight. And we sat down for 2 days of interviews that started at the beginning of his career at the CDC in the fall of 1961.
I was hired as a laborer, and the laborer washed glassware, sterilize it, and do all our prep work,
Arzell walked into the U.S. Public Health Service with an undergraduate degree from Morehouse College, an honorable discharge from the U.S. Marine Corps, and 0 laboratory experience.
I was in desperate need of employment. It was during the down years of the federal government, money short and all that. And I really didn't expect to get hired.
He then met John E. Martin Jr., also known as Dick Martin, a bacteriologist with the CDC who hailed from North Carolina and who ultimately became Arzell's manager.
He was the guy who hired me at CDC. He gave me a job when nobody else would. I think he thought I was smart.
Dick Martin knew that Arzell was eager to learn.
Dick did a preliminary interview, and during that time, he didn't want any black people working in the laboratory. I don't know what changed his mind, but it was changed after he had interviewed me and told me to go back down to the administrative office. I was thrilled to get hired, washing dishes and cleaning animal cages. Well, Dick was a smart guy, but he didn't like to do a whole lot of bench work. So when he saw that I did have some ability, potential, as a technician, he trained me to be a laboratory technician.
All of this happened within a couple of months of Arzell joining the CDC, and it was his first unofficial graduate course in bacteriology and laboratory work.
I didn't know anything about bacteriology at the time, and Dick asked me if I wanted to train to be a laboratory technician. And sure. I said, I did not take any bacteriology in college, so I know virtually very little, next to nothing about laboratory bacteriology. Well, oh, like, I'll teach you that. And he gave me a culture and asked me to see how many organisms I could identify in that culture. It was a mixed culture. He said, do you like working in bacteriology? I say, I love to learn new things I didn't know before. He said, well, we'll get you trained up, get you promotion one day. Oh, that sounded good. Dick was a very smart guy from the hills of North Carolina, Hickory. But he didn't like the drudgery of routine laboratory work, testing, retesting, and all that. And I loved it because I didn't have any experience. Yeah, he did a lot for me.
Arzell moved up the ranks quickly after he became a trusted lab technician working alongside Dick Martin. And their dynamic afforded Arzell more freedom and solitude in the lab, which he loved. One of their joint projects yielded a breakthrough in testing for gonorrhea and meningitis at a time when there was a gonorrhea epidemic and a new penicillin-resistant strain of the venereal disease. Even the New York Times described it as a rampant epidemic. According to officials at the California Public Health Department at the time, the gonorrhea caseload in urban areas was running 54% ahead of the previous year. And that number was a low estimate, as only 1 in 10 cases was reported. In June 1970, Arzell and Dick developed a culture medium to test meningitis and gonorrhea and detect tens of thousands of strains of gonorrhea that had previously gone undetected. This cultured medium is what ultimately led to a patent that Arzell had hung high on his office wall. I had noticed the patent through the years, but I didn't dare touch it until May 2025, when he explicitly asked me to get it off of the wall above his 6-foot-tall bookcase. The patent was officially issued on February 4th, 1973. And as I admired it, my granddad casually mentioned that his name was almost removed from the patent application.
This was early 70s. There was a doctor up there that didn't do shit of it and didn't know shit. Was outraged because they put my name on it. And there was a short article in the New York Times.
And there he was, in print in the New York Times. And to think, the patent was originally denied.
Yeah, that was difficult to come by. An individual who worked for the government never owned the patent. That belonged to the government and the people. I was on a trip to New York. I think I moved away from Dick and got another job. And he called me and said, our patent has been denied. He said, because you can't patent something that's already been in use for 50, 60, 70 years, culture media. I said, I'm going to talk to him. I'm going to get a stopover in Washington patent office there. And when this lawyer called me in, explained the difficulty with the patent, he thought we were trying to patent culture media. And I explained to him that we were trying to patent a special kind of culture media that has antibacterial restraining agents in it. And that was the idea with it, that we were trying to get the patent office to see. And a couple of weeks later, they awarded the patent. You have to justify the need for the patent, and I was able to do that. I didn't feel this was setting a big ass damn thing, because I had been doing that for almost everything that came into our laboratory. Dick was never there to do a damn thing. And actually, I enjoyed that, because for me, it was a great opportunity to learn.
In the years after his patent was awarded, Arzell transitioned from his work in the venereal diseases laboratory to evaluating hospitals and scientific laboratories across the nation, and then into the most unexpected role of his entire career at the CDC. In the late 1970s, he was appointed director of the Health Benefits Program related to the U.S. public health study of untreated syphilis at Tuskegee. I knew of the infamous study, how public health officials denied care for men and subjected them to unnecessary, painful medical procedures, including spinal taps, for 4 decades, all without their informed consent to even participate in the study. But I had no idea of my granddad's proximity to it. The Health Benefits Program was an internal CDC response that started in March of 1973, following the public exposure of the study by CDC venereal disease tracker Peter Buxton and Associated Press investigative reporter Gene Heller.
Interestingly enough, and maybe not so, the guy that caused the initiation, exposure, and national outcry against human experimentation was a white boy.
Now, the phrasing he used there set off an alarm in my mind, as though Peter Buxton wasn't the only person to raise objections to the study, but he was the one who broke through. I learned that there was also an epidemiologist and statistician, Dr. Bill Jenkins, a black man, who told his supervisor about the study and the ethical issues it presented in the 1960s. Unbeknownst to Dr. Jenkins, his supervisor was already monitoring the study and told him, quote, "Don't worry about it." Still, he wrote to reporters and shared the limited information he researched about Tuskegee, but he didn't garner any media coverage for the study. Peter Buxton, on the other hand, was able to expose everything he found out about what was happening in Tuskegee.
I remember when this kid started asking all these damn questions. He came into the program through the office in San Francisco. He was aware of the Nuremberg trial and human experimentation. And he wrote at CDC and wanted to know what's going on with it. Is the data still exists? Is it still being used, published and otherwise? Are they still collecting data? And following the, as the phrase goes, the participants. Of course they were. Nobody had said anything about that data publicly. And they were still talking about it in scientific. So they thought they would call him the CDC in Atlanta and scare the shit out of him. Instead of them scaring the shit out of him, he scared the shit out of him. Because the first question he raised, do you all remember the Nuremberg trial?
Peter's questions came in 1966 after he overheard colleagues talking about an Alabama physician who was reprimanded for providing penicillin to a man with late-stage syphilis. He could not fathom the idea of a physician being punished for providing appropriate care. So he started asking for information internally, and his colleagues in Atlanta gave him more than he requested. In fact, they mailed him a manila envelope of about 10 reports from the annual roundups of study participants. He also researched the Nuremberg trials at his local library. And Arzell wasn't exaggerating about Peter being summoned to Atlanta, which he was in March 1967, or his comparison to Nuremberg and Nazis. During a 2017 interview for The American Scholar, Peter said, "I was being called on the carpet, and they thought from the high position that they had that they were going to correct an errant employee." He also confirmed, "I directly compared the work of the CDC in Atlanta in Tuskegee to what the Nazis had done." After the atrocities at Nuremberg were publicly known, a new standard was introduced to medical ethics called the Nuremberg Code, which required voluntary consent and avoiding unnecessary physical and mental suffering and injury. That specific code was implemented in 1945, but that didn't disrupt the study, which had been running for 13 years at that point. Public exposure was the only remedy.
I think it broke in 72. 1972. And this young man, they couldn't keep him quiet. So he had left CDC and working towards a law degree. But while they were called CDC.
The expose was published nationwide on Tuesday, July 25th, 1972. And I wanted to know how my granddad found out about the study. When I asked him, he offered a single word:
inadvertently. I was working at CDC, and I was working in gonorrhea. And you know, something as big as that, they're talking about it all the time. And they just closed that out, and they said that the reason was that they'd run out of money.
And in 1978, Arzell got the call that he would be appointed director of the health benefits program for the men impacted by the study.
Well, when my boss called me in and told me that I was going to be put in charge of Tuskegee, and I said, I don't want any part of a mess that the United States government has already made. I've had so many goddamn jobs at CDC that nobody else wanted. Of course, I didn't want that in mind, and I think I cussed them out. My job was provide any help their doctor, not CDC, but their doctor determine what they need. Anything from round-the-clock nursing care to dental care and all that. And by that time, most of them had passed away.
The position also included Arzell's direct exposure to the tragic reality that this study was an autopsy-driven study.
They would save all the vital organs upon the death of the participants, those who were in the experimental group and also those who were in the control group. When I joined them, they had them in fruit jars. I was in charge of them. When they started shutting it down little pieces at a time, they shipped all those fruit jars to CDC, and I kept them in my office. I've forgotten how long, trying to get somebody to give me authority to dispose of them. That may have been a mistake on my part. And all of a sudden, all this data started coming in that was collected for some 40-something years. So I started making copies when there were not copies. Oftentimes there were many, many copies.
Some of those copies are what I found that Thanksgiving night in 2018. There were copies of photos that are featured in the National Archives that anyone in the world can access. And they were my grandfather's archives.
what I was interested in personally, how did it started, who authorized it, and those kinds of things. By the way, what the government paid them was nothing.
That government payment was the result of a class action lawsuit filed by Fred D. Gray against the Public Health Service on behalf of the survivors of the 600 black men who were subjected to the study. Ultimately, the lawsuit was settled out of court for $10 million, and here's what each person received. The $10 million settlement was divided into 4 categories. Living syphilitic group participants received $37,500. Heirs of deceased syphilitic group participants received $15,000. Living control group participants received $16,000. And heirs of deceased control group participants received $5,000. There was also the public apology from President Bill Clinton in 1997.
What was done cannot be undone, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry.
At the end of our lengthy conversation about the CDC and his work as the director of the health benefits program for the study, I asked my granddad if he regretted not quitting on the spot when his boss assigned him the role.
No. I told my supervisor when I took that job, I said, I'll make some mistakes, but I'm always going to make them on behalf of the beneficiaries.
What do you mean by that?
Whatever they want, what the government approves, sign off on it.
Every claim you got, you approved?
No, I didn't sign off on gold teeth. And I regret that I didn't do that.
After our conversation, something that my granddad said started bothering me more than anything else.
As the phrase goes, the participants.
In 1932, these men hadn't given informed consent. Hell, they didn't even know they were engaged in a study conducted by the US government. Plus, the archives only listed them as numbers. 400 in the control group, 200 in the experimental group. But who were these people? What did they mean to their families and friends? Who were they in the context of the broader community? How did they live their lives day to day? Thankfully, I've been able to find a few details, and I was even able to speak to a descendant of a man subjected to the U.S. public health study of untreated syphilis in Tuskegee. Tune in for episode 2 to hear our conversation, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode. Thank you for listening to Archival and this deeply special episode featuring my granddad. This interview was special because it occurred during my last visit with him in Atlanta before he passed away in July 2025. I am beyond grateful for all of the time and conversations we shared during his 91 years. Archival is a production of J. Tolliver Media, LLC.